In the previous clips, we created shares in several different ways, and we kind of ignored the permissions, and now we want to start to focus in on those. Now, we've got two types of primary permissions that we want to deal with: share permissions and security permissions, also known as NTFS permissions. We're going to start off with the share permissions. Now, I'm going to open up Explorer. Again, I'm on my server just for demonstration's sake, and I'm going to go out to one of the folders that we shared earlier. And I'm going to go to My Share and right click on it, go to Properties, and go to the Sharing tab. This is where I had shared it. There's My Share, shows you the share. And I'm going to go out to Advanced Sharing. And underneath Advanced Sharing, you see an option for permissions. Well, let's talk about permissions and shares for a second. Here's the way I like to think of it. I like to think of when I share a folder to the network and to the people on the network, it's like putting a front door on my house. In other words, I'm making a statement. Y'all can come on in anytime you want. Well, not necessarily everyone like I have listed here right now. I can refine this to who I want to let come in. I can let my friends in. I can let my really close friends in. And those are the people I trust the most. And when I let those people in, I can decide what they're allowed to do. Now, the share permissions are very simple permissions. Let me add a user. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add from company, I think I have my close friend, Don Jones. Now, when Don comes over and opens up the front door, he's allowed to come into the house. I don't want everyone to be able to just walk into my house. So Don's allowed to come in, and I'm going to give him the ability to read and change. And here's what that means. These permissions allow people to change files, write to files, and delete files. So if Don comes into my house, he can move my furniture and eat my food. It's okay. Now, there are other friends that I have. So let's grab, is Greg out there? Let's see. Do I have Greg? I certainly do. I love Greg. And so Greg's great, but I'm only going to let him read. So that means he can read files. He can't delete or erase anything or change anything in those files. And so when Greg comes over to my house, he can come in the front door. He can look at all my furniture. He can look at all my food, but he's not allowed to touch anything. So it works out well. Now, here I've controlled the permissions. Full control will give somebody, and I'm going to add in administrator. And I'm going to notice I'm adding in domain accounts for this. I'm going to see check names. And there's the domain administrator. I'm going to give the domain administrator full control, which means they can also change these permissions. Once these permissions are set up and I click apply, now my share only lets these people in when they try to map a drive to it and gives them those permissions. Now, this is a pretty simple concept, and you want to keep this simple and very basic. There is a challenge, though. Not everybody that you want to have in and changing things, such as Don, he can move my furniture, he can eat my food, but I don't want him moving the furniture in a certain room. In other words, I want more granular control over my files and folders. And to do that, we'll do that with NTFS permissions or the security permissions. Now, with the share permissions, like I said, you want to keep it pretty simple. And I'm going to say okay and keep these permissions right now, but I want to kind of show you, you can do this through Explorer if you're on the server. You can use the PowerShell commandlets, whether you're from your client or on the server. And of course, you can also use Server Manager. And I want to show you Server Manager to do those permissions. And again, you can use Server Manager from your client as well. So let's go to shares. And you'll see that I have shares right here. I've got that IT sharing. No, I was inspecting that earlier. And I wasn't too happy with the permissions that Greg had put on it. And so let's go look at those permissions again. So I'm going to go into permissions. Now you have to be a little bit careful because right here, we're getting kind of a confusing view of all of the permissions. So I'm going to say customize. And I want you to see this tab. We've got permissions here, which will be all of the NTFS permissions. We've got share permissions. Right now, the share permissions on that share is to allow everyone change access. Well, that's probably not what I want, especially if I just want them to be able to read the files that are in that folder, which is exactly what I think Greg wanted. So I'm going to edit these permissions. You can see that I'm capable of doing the same thing that I did through Explorer in Server Manager. It just looks a little bit different. So I'm going to set those permissions to read. And by the way, just to let you know that when you create a share, the default share permissions are everyone read. Now, I want you to notice something rather unique. It says the type of permissions. Again, you can see this through Explorer Server Manager. It says right now, allow permissions. Let me add a different permission and let me select a principal, and I'm going to choose company. And since this is Greg's share, let's give Greg specific permissions. I want you to see that I've chosen a particular person. This could be a group in Active Directory. It could be a group off the local machine. The type is an allow permission. If I were to change this to deny, in other words, deny Greg from being able to read or change, this will override any permissions that Greg has been given. So as an example, I'm going to say, okay, even though Greg is a member of the group everyone, and it's giving him read permissions, I've denied Greg. Well, I've denied him from the ability to change. I should go back in here. Yeah, I've got him denied from read as well. So I've denied Greg specifically, and that deny overrides everything else. Now, when you're assigning permissions, something to keep in mind, and we'll talk about this with NTFS permissions, is that these are cumulative. So if you assign a person a specific permission and they're a member of a group, those could add together. So with permissions, we like to keep it pretty simple on the share level. Do you want them to read or do you want them to change? And usually that's how you're probably grouping documents anyway. Documents that people should be able to modify versus documents that they can't modify. So I'm going to say apply and set the permissions for the IT share, and that'll clean up those particular permissions. As you can see, that setting basic permissions for a share are pretty straightforward. Now, what we really want to focus in on is, unfortunately, a little bit more complex. Those are the NTFS permissions. See, in my example, as I've been going through and